Hi, I'm Chris Wolfe. I'm president of the American Public Philosophy Institute and a professor of politics here at the University of Dallas. And today I'm really happy to be able to have the opportunity to interview an old friend. What is his name anyway? Fred Freddoso, who's from the University of Notre Dame, where he's the John and Jean Osterly Professor of Philosophy. And tonight he'll be giving a talk at the University of Dallas on the vindication of St. Thomas. Right now I want to find out a little bit about Fred's background, talk a little bit about your intellectual autobiography. So let's begin with your education. How did you? We want to find out how you got from there to here.
To here. Well, I started off as a seminarian, a high school seminarian actually. Let's see, this would have been 1959, and was in the seminary until 1968.
Is it back in Buffalo? Or?
This is back in Buffalo, the minor seminary first, and then to our new major seminary, which at that time was pretty full. We're talking over 150, between 150 and 200 probably seminarians, major seminarians in philosophy and theology. And then at the end of that period, in the summers of 67 and 68, through the generosity of a benefactor, I was able to afford 2 summer sessions at Notre Dame. So I took 2 courses in the summer of 67 and 2 courses in the summer of 68. Now, of course, the summer of 68 was when all hell broke loose. And I was on the Notre Dame campus for the publication of Humanae Vitae,
right.
So that was exciting. And at the same time, I made the decision that I was going to leave the seminary. Now, of course, that was 1968. This is before the draft lottery, so I automatically went to being 1A. And so immediately looked to cut myself a deal, taking advantage of my academic prowess. And I signed up for a 4-year hitch in the Army with the promise that I'd be studying languages, ultimately, or some language. Well, to make a long story short, in the January of 1969, as Joe Namath was defeating the Baltimore Colts, I found myself in Monterey, California, and I was there until mid-1970, and I ended up taking 2 extended courses in Russian. So I was a Russian language specialist. From there I went to the very middle of Texas, San Angelo and Goodfellow Air Force Base for some training, and then off to Berlin for 1.5 years. So I can't tell you what I was doing during that time, but it had something to do with Russian and listening.
Not reading philosophy, huh?
No. But of course, those were very tumultuous years. There were people in my unit. I mean, we had graduates of places like Bowdoin Brown and Columbia and all sorts of interesting characters. But so the time in the Army was it was unpleasant. I mean, it was unpleasant to go through, but in some ways it turned out to be a good thing for me. In the middle of that, Debbie and I got married also. So what was I going to do when I got out? Well, I was pretty naive academically. I had no idea. I had never even heard about the job situation, or I'm not even sure I knew what tenure was. I mean, I was just pretty naive. All I knew was I liked studying philosophy, and so that's what I did. Now, as far as the faith was concerned, being out of the seminary in the world was kind of a shock to me, and it was about during the middle of my time in the Army where I kind of drifted away. But I knew I loved philosophy, and I had the GI Bill to help pay for living expenses during graduate school, and so I applied selectively because I was naive again, and ended up at Notre Dame as a PhD student. And academically, I thrived there. Of course, at that time, Notre Dame had pretty much become what they called a pluralistic department. There was hardly any Thomism left anymore. There were a few Thomists. But of course, I wanted to be part of the avant-garde anyway, and so I dove into Anglo-American philosophy. Wilfrid Sellars, who was popular among my teachers. I mean, I was doing all the jumping through all the hoops, but also in the back of my mind, I had an appreciation of and some understanding of scholastic philosophy going. I had done some work on the logic, for instance, of William of Ockham. I knew I had taken courses in Thomistic philosophy as a seminarian, and so that background stayed with me even as I was branching out into other areas. So it's a kind of, in retrospect, when I look back on it now, I say maybe I would be closer to the truth if I had never abandoned St. Thomas in the first place. On the other hand, what I had to do was to attain some facility at trying to relay what I took to be true positions on important issues in philosophy to what was going on the contemporary scene as well. And so I think that back and forth was a creative moment for me, and so I got a reputation basically as someone who could do a really good job explaining and defending various scholastic positions to contemporary philosophers. And so that's pretty much the story of my career up until maybe 10 years ago or so.
Were there many analytical philosophers interested in hearing what the scholastics said?
There was. That's a really interesting question. Among philosophers of religion, because of the efforts of some prominent evangelical philosophers like my colleague Alvin Plantinga, William Malston, who at the time was teaching at Syracuse, and Robert Adams, and others, right in the middle of what otherwise would be thought of as very secularized English-speaking philosophy pops up this rather noticeable movement in so-called philosophy of religion. Now, I won't go into a characterization of philosophy of religion. Let's just put it this way. You had a lot of mainly evangelical, but a good smattering of Catholics as well, and some atheists interested in questions, especially at the beginning, about God, the divine nature, proofs for the existence of God, proofs against the existence of God, the problem of evil, and all of that. And in addition to some rather more complicated issues, like the ones I got involved with when I looked at the 16th century De Auxiliis dispute. This arose because of certain things that evangelicals had written about the response to the problem of evil involving certain kinds of counterfactual knowledge on God's part. And at one point, Bob Adams had written an article which, when I talked with him about it, he said to me, someone ought to be looking at this character, Luis de Molina, this 16th century Jesuit, and maybe translate and explain his positions on providence and foreknowledge and to the rest of the philosophical world. I actually undertook that. I got an NEH grant for it, and so I had a foot on the contemporary scene at the same time as I was still doing scholasticism. So in that sense, I was neither here nor there, but I was both at the same time, and it was enough to move my career forward anyway, if nothing else, because there weren't too many people in a position to be able to do both things. And then from there, once I had said everything I wanted to say about that particular issue, I moved on to issues having to do with, for instance, causality. And what I tried to do there was to bring scholastic discussions of causality into contact with what was going on once again in the contemporary literature. And that led to some success. There's another side note. I changed my introduction to philosophy class around that same time, probably the early 90s sometime. I finally decided, maybe it was after reading the Phaedo enough times, that the standard sort of introductory course that was being done at Notre Dame, which would be something like what we call a problems-oriented course. So you'd have a section on God, 3 arguments for the existence of God, 2 arguments against the existence of God. Then you'd have a section on philosophy of mind, 2 arguments for materialism, 2 arguments for dualism, freedom. 1 argument for freedom, 1 argument against freedom of the will, that kind of thing. In the end, if I had read my Plato carefully, I would have seen this long before that. The worry is that what you're producing is a kind of pessimism about reasoned discourse. And actually, the very scene occurs in the Phaedo. After Socrates presents 3 arguments for the immortality of the soul, and Simmias and Cebes interject their 2 arguments against the immortality of the soul, all of Socrates' friends, most of whom were not philosophers themselves, get depressed like a bunch of intro students. And Socrates feels like he has to go out of his way to address this issue, and gives a famous little homily where he compares the hatred of reasoned discourse to misanthropy. You've been jilted by a few arguments and now you hate all of them, just like the misanthrope hates everybody after being disappointed by a few people. So I just decided to throw together an intro course where I would just be reading things I really enjoyed reading, and also that might give the students some insight into what philosophy is all about.
So what were some of those?
Well, the interesting thing is I threw these books together without, I said I think interesting themes will emerge from this. I'm not absolutely sure, but I think some interesting themes will emerge from this. Well, they were the Apology and the Phaedo from Plato. I didn't do any Aristotle explicitly, because Aristotle's pretty hard for intro students to read, but I got Aristotle incorporated by making certain choices with texts from St. Thomas. The most important text from St. Thomas that I used was the first 9 chapters of the Summa Contra Gentiles, because that really is the heart of St. Thomas's account of the relationship between faith and reason, between faith and philosophy, faith and science.
Because he's not addressing theology students as in the Summa Theologiae, he's actually addressing often non-Catholics.
In this, the Summa Contra Gentiles is interesting because actually that introduction is, I think, addressed to Christian readers of the Summa Contra Gentiles. Now, the Summa Contra Gentiles itself is a discussion between Christian philosophers on the one hand and non-Christians on the other. I think of it as St. Thomas and St. Augustine and some of their friends making a day trip from Paradiso down to the first circle of the Inferno, where all the philosophers are sitting around just like Socrates wanted, talking about wisdom. But the first 9 chapters, though, the introduction, in essence, say to the Christian reader, look, this is what wisdom is. Well, philosophical wisdom, because we also know there's the virtue, the gift of the Holy Spirit. I mean, this is a very interesting contrast. But he says, look, when we're talking to the pagans, all we have to go on is reason, which isn't all that much. The fact is that nobody's faith should depend on the success of any particular conversation like this with the pagans. you're being perfectly reasonable if you accept on faith even those parts of the faith which philosophers have been or should have been able to demonstrate, because God understands, first of all, that people have other things to do with their lives, sometimes very important things, and furthermore, that not everybody's cut out to be a philosopher or a theologian. In that, St. Thomas agrees with Aristotle and Plato, of course. And so it's reasonable to accept these things on faith, and yet it's still a noble task to attempt to show the best of the philosophers that Christian wisdom is at least plausibly thought to be a possible fulfillment of their aspirations. Now, this is a long and complicated conversation that's going to take 3 books of the Contra Gentiles and then the 4th book. So, okay. And I try to bring the students around to see the big picture here. But, okay, so St. Thomas is saying, look, this is important for our faith to carry on this conversation. It might not be important for the faith of this particular individual, you or some other simple believer. And in the end, we're called to be saints, not philosophers. But nonetheless, the Catholic faith has always had this, Catholic theology has always had a dominant strain which says, not only is the faith the truth, but it's also at least as reasonable as any alternative, okay, and maybe more. So we need to talk about that. And as opposed to, for instance, the kind of attitude that one finds in Lutheran theology, Karl Barth, who dismissed natural theology, for instance. Okay, St. Thomas thinks all of this is important. We have different avenues to the truth, and it could be important for some of these people. There aren't too many conversions by way of philosophical argument, but for some people it might be important. But it's just good for all of us to understand that there are parts of what's been revealed that are accessible to everyone, anyone of goodwill and good intellect, basically.
Even apart from people who are actually persuaded by philosophical arguments to kind of move toward the faith, there's also another category of people, it seems to me, where it's at least an obstacle to them, to their approaching the faith, right. If they have some kind of suspicion that reason doesn't really lead in that direction. And so, while I think philosophical arguments don't usually bring people to the faith, clearing away bad philosophical arguments, I think, is often very important.
Yeah, I think that's right. It's really unfortunate in the United States. The dialectic has been between scientistic secularists on the one hand and fundamentalist Christians on the other hand. And if you're a Catholic, you sit on the sidelines and you say, oh, gee, a pox on both your houses. I mean, both of you people, you need therapy. So, in order to understand that, there can be fruitful dialogue here. And that even though tensions perhaps between philosophy and science on the one hand and faith on the other are unavoidable, those tensions, we are confident, and this is very Thomistic, we're confident these tensions can be resolved in a way that respects everyone's fundamental methods of coming to the truth. And so it can get a little bit frustrating. That's the way it is with being a Catholic philosopher. Even in the talk I'm giving for your lecture series tonight, it's very frustrating when you come across a certain philosophical problem is defined in a certain way, and it's defined in such a way that the everybody thinks that there are these two solutions or these three solutions. And, you know, as a Thomist, you come to this and you say, wait a minute, my position isn't, I think you guys set this problem up in the wrong way. You know, there's something wrong with the problematic, but that happens, and it's very interesting. I mean, you might think academia, everyone's smart, everyone's trying to be fair-minded and set up the discussion in the right way, right? Well, everyone might have goodwill, but you can still make mistakes. So.
So it sounds like when you were teaching, redoing this introductory class, that really got you into the whole question of faith and reason.
Exactly. You know, I chose, for instance, the next thing that in addition to those first 9 chapters of the Summa Contra Gentiles, we also read St. Thomas's treatise on happiness, and a lot of Aristotle comes in there, so that was there. So we did some both theoretical, metaphysical type philosophy, and then some moral and ethical type of philosophy also. Then I read the first 4 parts of Descartes' Discourse, not the Meditations, the Discourse, because the Discourse is where he tells you what he's up to and why he's up to it. And so I thought, yeah, that would be interesting, because we've been talking about philosophy as seeking wisdom. Well, okay, how does Descartes fit into all of that? And then, in a way to supplement the outline of the St. Thomas's Natural Theology, which I had earlier given them, I decided to do most of David Hume's Dialogues Concerning Natural Religion. Very interesting book. Once again, you find a discussion between someone that St. Thomas would think of as leaning too far in the direction of anthropomorphism and someone who's leaning too far in the direction of a kind of obscurantism about God's nature. And the position that he likes is not represented at all. So it's a kind of interesting, and along with the fact that Hume is just a great stylist and an interesting character in his own right. And then the next book was the first 3 chapters of John Stuart Mill's On Liberty. Don't ask me why I chose that exactly, but I did, and
well, you're getting the students where they are, because they typically come into class holding those opinions, I think.
Well, they used to.
Yeah.
It's interesting.
That's true,
I did it this year. Okay, make that 2015, the fall of 2015, when there was all this campus unrest, and now students aren't so sure they believe in unfettered free speech. Yeah. And once again, from a Catholic perspective, I can appreciate arguments on both sides. So hey, so I hope this is. So this year it turned out to be exciting to do it, but also Mill has this very strong notion of individuality and autonomy, which is also needs to be discussed in by contemporary philosophers in intro classes even. And then to scare them, we read 3 parts of Nietzsche's Beyond Good and Evil, the part on the religious nature, the history of morals, and one other part I can't remember now. And then we end with the first 9 books of Augustine's Confessions. So when I put those together and taught that course a few times, I was getting all sorts of ideas about papers on, especially on faith and reason related topics, but on other things as well. So it's kind of interesting how that happens, how an intro class can be important in your intellectual development. Of course, over time, I had come back to the church, become a rock-ribbed Catholic, and so that you have to add that to the mix as well. So,
when you mentioned about often Catholicism, having a position distinct from others, it makes me think of Chesterton's Catholicism is the yes but religion. Is man evil? Is man good? Well, yeah, yes, he's evil, but he's good, but. And of course, Chesterton is one of your favorite writers, and you use him often in your courses.
I'm teaching Chesterton in my last semester of teaching, so yeah, we're in the middle of The Everlasting Man right now, after having read Orthodoxy.
If one of your colleagues said, why are you reading this, scribbler, this journalist in your philosophy classes? Is this guy really so serious intellectually that you should be using him in class?
Well, sometimes I wonder that myself when I, because as a philosopher, I keep interpreting Chesterton in a way that maybe is most favorable to him. On the other hand, when I go back and read it more carefully, I realize that I'm not attributing to him anything that's really not already there. And so, in a sense, Chesterton has the seeds of an awful lot of the best of what's happened in philosophy since the time that Orthodoxy and the Everlasting Man were published. I probably shouldn't have done this. I once at least hinted to Alistair MacIntyre that maybe almost everything he had to say was already in Chesterton. Oh.
How did he react to that?
Actually, that's not really fair to him, because he's got all of these wonderful historical ideas. But the fact is that there's a lot, Chesterton, for instance, in Orthodoxy, the 2 chapters criticizing these modern writers he was reading, one is basically a criticism of modernism, and the other one, in 1908, is a criticism of postmodernism. And in that second chapter, he says, hey, you bishops, forget about modernism, that's dead. Worry about postmodernism, this kind of pessimism about reason, which of course was the theme of JP2's Fides et Ratio. So Chesterton was a man ahead of his times with respect, very perspicacious about philosophical movements. But I think of The Everlasting Man as one of the great books of the 20th century. Actually, this semester, I have some interesting students who, more than in the past, have challenged Chesterton at every step along the way. I make them write a comment before and hand it in to me before every class for each day's readings. And oftentimes I just begin the class by reading, okay, here's so-and-so's comment, let's think about this, or here's so-and-so's comment, let's think about that. But even under that kind of scrutiny, and even taking into account, you have to take into account the fact that Chesterton is a journalist, and so he's not concerned with the kind, with philosophical precision in a way that a philosopher might want him to be. Nonetheless, the pages are just pregnant with interesting ideas and takes on things, and they shake you up oftentimes. That's what he's good for, yeah.
Well, one of the things you're going to be talking about tonight is the fact that while many things on the philosophical landscape these days look fairly pessimistic, you think there might be some hope in that there is a kind of reviving interest in St. Thomas in unexpected places, not necessarily in religious places, but even in secular philosophy.
Well, this is the sort of thing you would expect if there's any hope for academic philosophy at all. You would expect, you would expect people to be honest enough when they hit walls to go in search of different ways of thinking about problems and formulating problems. And the philosophy has its history, and even though certain movements important movements in English-speaking philosophy, especially in the first half of the 20th century, were really ahistorical, almost a rejection of the history of philosophy. You guys weren't really doing philosophy. That's been overcome, and the more people who study the history of philosophy, going back from the pre-Socratics through ancient philosophy and into modern philosophy, that's what they usually do. They skip medieval. Well, that's okay as long as they do modern, because that or classical philosophy, because that always gives you your entry into medieval philosophy as well. Then they get the idea eventually, hey, maybe these guys were talking about problems similar to the ones we had. The history of philosophy is not like the history of science. The history of science is mainly, it's good for scientists to know the history of science, but you don't expect some old theory to tomorrow be discovered as, oh, phlogiston, that was the answer all along, you know. No, that doesn't happen in the natural sciences, but in philosophy, it can happen.
What would be an example of that?
Well, Alistair MacIntyre writes this book published in 1981, After Virtue, which basically says, we've got an impasse in contemporary moral theory. All of the various proposals about how to think about right and wrong, good and evil, none of them really works, and when you try to put them together, you just get this incoherent mishmash, and that's what we have in our culture is we can't even have a discussion because we don't have any common ground, basically, on which to have that discussion. What we have are fragments of various moral theories in the past, kind of walking around without any context. And so his advice, as Miss Anscombe had advised before, was to, well, let's go back and read someone like Aristotle and try to understand how you build up a moral theory, what a moral theory is supposed to be about, et cetera, et cetera. And this book just takes off, a philosophical bestseller. There aren't too many of those, because people understand that there's a kind of crisis, at least crisis in the sense that, gosh, it doesn't seem like we can make any progress here attempting to debate various issues, some of which are very important for our culture. So MacIntyre's book makes this big splash, and then people start saying, yeah, let's do virtue theory, okay, without having much of an understanding of what that involves, but little by little, they come to understand a little bit better, and 30 years later, you can say, okay, there's some discernible progress here. A possibility that wasn't being taken seriously before is now being taken seriously. And so in that sense, you have a little movement. I mean, it doesn't mean everybody is converted to the Church of Aristotle or anything like that, but at least it adds another voice to the mix, and it adds an important voice to the mix, because people now understand that they have to take it seriously. So that would be one example of what happens.
Well, maybe we should conclude by asking about your magnum opus that you're working on here. What made you think of the idea of doing a single authored translation of St. Thomas's Summa Theologiae?
You know, I can't even remember the beginnings of this anymore, because it was so long ago, and it seemed to have made so little progress. At a certain point, well, I knew this is what I've been good at in my philosophical career. My most success has been books in which I do a translation of what I take to be an important text, and then do a long philosophical commentary on it, trying to bring it onto the contemporary scene. I've done this 3 times in my career. And everyone always praised the translations, okay? And then I was appointed the Austerley Professor of Thomistic Studies, and I said, well, I should take that Thomistic Studies part seriously, you know? And I knew from trying to teach the Summa on my own, that's an interesting story too. I was actually prodded by undergraduates in, I guess this must have been the mid-90s. I can remember one semester, a bunch of undergraduates came to me and said, we want a course on St. Thomas's Ethics, and we want you to teach it. And I said, well, my way of teaching a course like that is to read the text. And so I gave them a course in which I tried to cover the whole of the first part of the second part of the Summa, which is more or less St. Thomas's general moral theory. I mean, we didn't read all of it, but I tried to make sure we read a lot of it and some from each of the parts and tried to put them together. Of course, this was completely hopeless. We had some great classes, but I mean, I had some understanding of it, but it really helped me to come into it. But what I found was the translation was just not very good English. Now, I also knew there were a few places where it was actually inaccurate. You have to understand that the translations that we have, the one that's most widely available on the internet was a group project, basically. I think this happened just after World War II. You know, it was divvied out among a bunch of Dominicans. There's also the 60-volume one where you have different authors for each of the volumes that came out later. But I find them all, and that one's very uneven. The one that's widely available is really hard to understand in some places, and I think just inaccurate in others. And it was at a point in my career where I wanted to go back to St. Thomas and study St. Thomas seriously, so I figured I'm going to be reading the Latin text anyway. Why don't I take a shot at translating it? I remember telling this to Scott Hahn, and he looked at me and he said, "No, you have to write great things." And I'm thinking, and I said to him, "No, I'm better at this than I am at writing great things, right?" So, and so even he signed off on it after a while. So I began to do it and to put it up on my website and getting good feedback. And so I said, okay, I think I'm going to commit myself to this, even though there have been stretches of a year and a half sometimes where I haven't been able to do anything. I've had a couple of leaves, so I, work on it hard during then, and now I have the big leave in the sky coming, retirement. And I'm up to the treatise on charity in the second part of the second part. But I just felt it was important to have a good, readable, accurate translation. And if one person is doing it, that at least gives you a hope of some kind of consistency throughout. Now, even it's such a big text that you can't guarantee even that, but at least that's what I'm shooting for. And I hope maybe if I push everything else out of the way in the first few years of retirement, I'll actually be able to make some progress and get there.
That will be wonderful,
yeah.
A real gift to the rest of us. Well, it's been great talking to you today. There's so many other things we could talk about, Catholic higher education. And
I'm glad we didn't get there, Chris.
But thanks very much for being with us. I hope this actually stimulates your interest in Fred's work. He has a website that's connected with his website at his page on the Notre Dame philosophy department website. And it includes much of his writing, popular writings as well as scholarly ones. And I really encourage our viewers to take a look at some of the many interesting articles that he has there. So thanks again, Fred, and so long to you all.
It's been a pleasure, Chris.